Welcome back to class, everyone. Today we are setting the clock back to a very specific and I think often misunderstood window of time.
We really are. We're looking at just 2 months.
Right, just November and December of 1940.
It's a fascinating period to study. Usually when people think of 1940, the mind goes straight to the summer, the fall of France, Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, the drama is just so high in those summer months.
Exactly. But by November, the immediate threat of a German invasion of England had, well, technically receded. Operation Sea Lion was postponed.
So I feel like the natural assumption for a lot of people is to think, okay, winter's coming, the weather is turning, things must have quieted down for a bit.
Right. But looking at the history, that is absolutely not the case. Far from it, actually.
Not a quiet winter at all.
Not even close. In fact, I would argue that while the summer of 1940 defined the survival of Britain, these 2 months, November and December, they defined the future scope of the entire Second World War.
Wow.
Yeah, it is the exact moment the conflict transforms from this desperate European defense into a really complex global geopolitical chess match.
I love that image. So, Professor, take me to school here. If we aren't looking at the skies over London during these 2 months, where should we be looking?
We need to look everywhere else. We need to look at Washington, D.C., the Mediterranean Sea, the freezing mountains of Albania, the deserts of North Africa, and of course, secret conference rooms in Berlin.
So it really blows wide open.
It does. The thesis for our discussion today is pretty straightforward. This is the tipping point. This is where the Axis consolidates its power, where the Allies find their first real glimmer of hope on the ground, and where the most fatal decision of the entire war is secretly made.
Okay, let's unpack this, and I want to start across the Atlantic, actually, because on November 5th, 1940, something massive happened to the United States.
Yes, Franklin D. Roosevelt was reelected.
Right, a historic third term. But why does an American election matter so much for a European war at this exact moment?
To understand why it matters, you really have to understand the position the U.S. was in right then.
Because they weren't in the war yet.
They were not. And the American public was deeply, deeply divided. Isolationism was incredibly strong.
People just didn't want to get involved.
Exactly. There was a huge portion of the population that wanted absolutely nothing to do with Europe's problems.
I remember reading that at this time, the U.S. Army was surprisingly small. Like, shockingly small.
It was tiny. It was roughly comparable to the size of the Belgian army in 1940.
That is wild to think about today.
It really is. Militarily, the U.S. was a minnow on the world stage. Economically, sure, a giant, but militarily completely unready. So Roosevelt had to walk this very tightrope during the election.
He had to play the politician.
Right, he had to campaign on neutrality to win the votes, promising American mothers he wouldn't send their boys into foreign wars.
But he wins, and he wins decisively.
He does, and that victory freed his hands politically. It allowed him to solidify the policy of supporting Great Britain.
Even without declaring war.
Exactly. He couldn't declare war, but he could begin turning the U.S. into the arsenal of democracy. It signaled to Hitler and Mussolini that the United States would not remain passive forever.
It paved the way for all that massive material support later on.
Yes, it did.
If you're enjoying this video, please watch it until the end. It helps the channel a lot and encourages us to continue our work.
So, politically, the board was tilting toward the Allies in Washington, even if the soldiers weren't there yet.
It creates this sense of inevitable momentum.
It does, but it is very important to remember that while FDR was securing his political future, the British were still very much alone in the actual fight.
Right. And in November, the focus of that fight shifted violently to the Mediterranean.
Yes, it did.
This brings us to November 11th, the Battle of Taranto. Now, when I hear naval battle, I usually think of two huge fleets lining up and blasting away at each other with big guns.
Like Jutland or something.
Exactly. But this was different, wasn't it?
Completely different. This wasn't a fleet action in that sense. This was a raid, and it was revolutionary.
How so?
The British Royal Navy launched an air attack on the Italian fleet, which was anchored in the safety of the harbor at Taranto.
And we aren't talking about modern jets roaring in here. These were swordfish biplanes.
Right. They look like something straight out of World War I.
They had open cockpits, didn't they?
Yes. String bags, they called them.
Yeah.
Slow, obsolete-looking biplanes with fabric-covered wings. But they carried torpedoes.
And they flew in at night.
At night, into a heavily defended harbor. And in one single night, they crippled half of Italy's capital ships.
That is just incredible. A handful of outdated biplanes shifting the balance of power in the whole Mediterranean.
Precisely. It proved once and for all that battleships, which were the undisputed queens of the sea at the time, were highly vulnerable to air power.
It must have been a huge relief for the British supply lines.
It aggressively shifted the naval balance. It gave the British much more freedom to move supplies to Egypt and Malta. And perhaps most ominously for the future, it was a tactic that naval observers from Japan studied very, very closely.
The parallel to Pearl Harbor is just impossible to miss.
It was a direct inspiration.
So the Italians are having a disastrous time at sea. But a few days later, on November 14th, things went completely sideways for them on land too.
Yes, this is one of the great underdog stories of the war. Mussolini had invaded Greece back in late October.
He expected it to be easy, right?
He expected a walkover. He really wanted to impress Hitler with his own rapid conquest, kind of a parallel to what Germany did in France.
The famous Greek walk.
Except the Greeks didn't walk away. They dug in and they fought back fiercely in this terrible mountainous terrain.
And then they turned the tables.
They did. By November 14th, the Greek army launched a massive counterattack. They didn't just stop the Italian advance.
They pushed him back.
They pushed them entirely out of Greece and back across the border into Albania.
That must have been an absolute shock to the system for the Axis.
It was humiliating. The Greeks were advancing and capturing key cities in southern Albania.
In just a month.
Just a month. This was the first major land victory against the Axis powers in the entire war. Up until then, the Axis ground forces seemed totally invincible.
It shattered the myth.
It did. And for Hitler, it was a strategic nightmare. He suddenly had a highly vulnerable southern flank to worry about, right when he wanted everything quiet in the east.
So Mussolini is just floundering. But while Italy is flailing around militarily, Germany is busy playing a completely different game.
A much more subtle game.
Right. Which brings us to the diplomatic maneuvering in late November. It seems like while Italy was losing battles, Germany was winning entire countries.
That is a very astute way to put it. Hitler realized he needed to secure the Balkans quickly, especially with the absolute chaos Mussolini had just caused in Greece.
But he didn't want to invade them all.
No, he didn't want to fight for every inch of it if he didn't have to. He used diplomacy, economic pressure, and flat-out intimidation.
Let's look at the timeline, because it really is like a domino effect.
It happens incredibly fast. On November 20th, Hungary joins the Tripartite Pact, the Axis alliance. 3 days later, on November 23rd, Romania joins. And the very next day, November 24th, Slovakia signs up.
Why were they so eager to join? Was it just fear of the German army?
It was a complex mix of fear, political opportunism, and necessity. Hungary, for instance, wanted territorial gains and economic favors from Germany.
They wanted to revise the borders from World War I.
Exactly. Now, Romania, they were terrified of the Soviet Union to their east, and they hoped aligning with Germany would protect them.
Plus, they had resources.
Vital resources. They were essentially the gas station of the early war. They had the Ploye oil fields, which Hitler desperately needed to fuel his tanks and planes.
And what about Slovakia?
Slovakia was essentially a client state already. They were politically and economically totally dependent on Germany.
So they didn't have much of a choice.
Not really, but look at the result. In the span of just 4 days, Germany consolidated control over a huge swath of Eastern Europe without firing a single shot.
They created a massive buffer zone.
A buffer zone and a secure resource hub, all locked in by treaty.
So the map of Europe is changing rapidly in November. You have the Axis expanding eastward in the Balkans. You have the fighting raging down in Greece. What about the neighbors who are just watching this happen? What is happening in Turkey?
Turkey is in an incredibly difficult and precarious position.
Because they're right next door.
Right. They are watching the war close in on their borders from the Balkans and the Mediterranean. So on November 25th, right after this expansion of the Axis into Romania and Bulgaria, Turkey declares martial law in its strategic zones.
Places like Istanbul.
Yes, Istanbul, Thrace, and the Dardanelles.
They are bracing for impact.
They absolutely are. They are terrified of being the next domino to fall in Hitler's diplomatic or military game.
It must have been a terrifying time for the civilians there.
It was. But there is a really fascinating, humanizing detail from this period that often gets lost when we just talk about grand strategy and army.
Oh, you're talking about the ship? The Kurtuluş.
Yes, the SS Kurtuluş. In December, specifically around December 19th, this Turkish cargo ship began delivering humanitarian aid materials to Greece.
Wait, so While Turkey is declaring martial law and desperately trying to stay neutral, they are sending aid to the Greeks, who are actively fighting the Italians.
Exactly. Greece was suffering a terrible famine due to the naval blockades and the sheer destruction of the war.
And Turkey stepped in.
They did. Despite the long, complicated historical tensions between Turks and Greeks, and despite the immense danger of sailing in a war zone, Turkey sent food and medical supplies.
It really highlights the complexity of neutrality in a world war.
It does. It wasn't just about hiding behind a border. It was about navigating a horrific humanitarian crisis happening right on your doorstep.
That is a really powerful image, a single cargo ship trying to help amidst total war.
It connects to this bigger picture of regional solidarity against foreign aggression, even when governments are too afraid to formally enter the fight. It's a rare moment of humanity in a very dark winter.
Okay, we have covered the diplomatic expansion and the Greek surprise, but we need to go back to the desert now, because December brought another massive shift. We talked about the Italians getting pushed back in Greece, but they had also invaded Egypt, right?
Yes, earlier in the year, in September, they had advanced across the border into Egypt and then just stopped.
They didn't push for Alexandria.
No, they built a series of fortified defensive camps in the desert and basically just sat there.
Waiting for what? Orders?
Supplies, maybe water pipelines, or perhaps just a lack of initiative from the commanders. But the British forces facing them didn't wait. On December 9th, they launched Operation Compass.
And from what I understand, this wasn't just a minor skirmish or a probe.
No, this was a masterclass in modern desert warfare. British, Indian, and other Commonwealth troops launched a massive surprise attack.
How did they pull her off?
They used the vastness of the desert to their advantage. They bypassed the Italian fortified camps, swung through the open desert, attacked them from the rear, and caused absolute chaos.
The results were staggering, weren't they? I recall seeing the numbers regarding the prisoners taken.
It was a complete rout. They didn't just kick the Italian army out of Egypt, they chased them hundreds of miles deep into Libya.
The numbers are hard to wrap your head around.
The British captured tens of thousands of Italian soldiers, huge amounts of equipment, tanks, artillery, all with relatively few casualties of their own.
So let's recap the scoreboard for the end of the year. The Italians are losing badly in Greece. They are collapsing in North Africa. British morale must have been sky high.
It was a massive, much-needed boost. For the first time in the war, the Allies had clear, decisive victories on land.
It proved the Axis could bleed.
It proved they could be beaten. And for Mussolini, it was a total disaster. He had tried to fight a parallel war alongside Hitler to show Italian strength, and he had failed catastrophically on every single front.
This brings us to perhaps the most ominous part of our timeline. While the British are celebrating in the desert and the Greeks are holding the line in the snowy mountains, something is happening in a dark room in Berlin.
Something that is going to change the fate of the world.
We are talking about December 18th, 1940.
Yes. Directive number 21.
This is the pivotal moment.
It is. Adolf Hitler officially signs the directive for Operation Barbarossa.
The operational plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Now, up until this point, Germany and the Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right. They had literally carved up Poland together the year before. But Hitler had always hated Bolshevism. It was his ideological archenemy. It was always his long-term goal to expand eastward.
To get that Lebensraum.
Living space, yes. And on December 18th, he formalized the military plan to make it happen.
But wait, look at the board. Britain is still fighting. The RAF is still flying. They just bombed Toronto. The Royal Navy is still controlling the seas. Why open a second massive front before you finish the first one?
That is the tragic irony and the ultimate strategic blunder of the Nazi regime.
It seems like madness.
Hitler convinced himself of a very flawed logic. He believed that Britain was only holding on because they were secretly hoping for Soviet support in the future.
Ah, so he thought eliminating Russia eliminates British hope.
Exactly. He thought if he smashed the Soviet Union quickly in a massive summer campaign, Britain would lose all hope and finally sue for peace.
So he decides to attack the largest country on Earth to defeat an island nation in the West. That seems incredibly counterintuitive.
It was pure hubris. He believed the Wehrmacht was completely unstoppable after the fall of France. The directive set the target date for the spring of 1941.
Meaning the clock was ticking.
It meant that the war, which was already expanding into Africa and the Balkans, was about to become a war of annihilation on a scale humanity had never, ever seen.
It really is the tipping point. You can literally see the train leaving the station, heading toward a cliff.
You can. And we can see the darkness of the Nazi regime spreading in other ways during these 2 months, too, not just military planning.
Right, in December, we also see the situation in Bulgaria deteriorating rapidly.
Yes, regarding their domestic laws.
This is the new legislation they passed, right?
Yes. The Bulgarian parliament voted on what they called the Law for the Protection of the Nation.
Which is a euphemism, of course.
It usually is. In reality, it was a severe pro-fascist, anti-Semitic piece of legislation.
Modeled on the Nuremberg laws.
Exactly. It restricted the rights of the Jewish population in Bulgaria, stripped them of property, heavily taxed them, and excluded them from public life.
And the crazy thing is, this is before Bulgaria even officially joined the Axis alliance.
That's the key point to understand. They wouldn't sign the Tripartite Pact formally until March 1941.
But they were already falling in line.
This legislation signaled that they were already drifting completely into Germany's orbit ideologically. They were voluntarily adopting the legal framework of the Holocaust to appease Berlin and prepare for that alliance.
It shows how the war wasn't just about lines on a map or securing oil. It was actively exporting a horrific ideology into the Balkans.
It is deeply chilling.
It really is a study in contrast for these 2 months. You have the military victories for the Allies in the Mediterranean and Africa, providing this sudden glimmer of hope for the free world.
But at the exact same time, behind closed doors, you have the Axis solidifying its grip on Eastern Europe diplomatically, planning the largest invasion in human history, and institutionalizing persecution.
If you were a British soldier driving a tank in Libya in December 1940, you felt like you were finally winning the war.
But if you were a Jewish citizen in Bulgaria or a civilian huddled in a shelter in London, the world felt like it was getting darker by the day.
So, as we wrap up this discussion on November and December of 1940, how should we synthesize all this for everyone listening? We started by saying this period was the tipping point.
I think we have to look at it this way. 1940 ended not with the swift, decisive invasion of Britain that everyone feared all summer.
Sea Lion never happened.
Right. It ended with the grim realization that the war was going to be terribly long and it was going to happen everywhere.
It wasn't just England versus Germany anymore, it was global.
Completely. Germany had secured the Balkans through diplomacy and intimidation. They had secretly committed their military to the invasion of Russia. That decision alone ensured the conflict would drag on for years and consume millions of lives.
But simultaneously, the Axis wasn't perfect.
No. Italy's abject military failures in Greece and North Africa revealed massive cracks in the Axis armor. It showed the world that Germany would have to constantly divert forces to bail out its junior partner.
Which eventually drains German resources.
Exactly. It stretches them thin. And let's not forget Roosevelt. The arsenal of democracy was officially open for business. The geopolitical pieces were actively moving into place for the truly global conflict that would define 1941.
It really completely challenges the old narrative of a quiet winter where everyone just rested in their trenches.
There was nothing quiet about it at all. It was the frantic, desperate calm before the ultimate storm. The decisions made by leaders in these 2 short months to counterattack in the Albanian mountains, to strike deep in the African desert, to sign Directive 21 in Berlin, they determined the fate of millions of people.
It's a very sobering thought. We so often look for the big, loud explosions in history, the D-Days, the Pearl Harbors, the Stalingrads.
The cinematic moments.
Right. But sometimes, history actually turns on a signature on a piece of paper in December, or raid by a few dozen outdated biplanes in November.
And that is exactly why we study it, to see those hidden connections that shape our world.
Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion today on the tipping point of late 1940. It is a lot of heavy material to process, but it really sets the stage perfectly for everything that comes next in the war.
It certainly does.
I want to leave you all with one final thought to chew on. We talked about Hitler's fateful decision to invade the Soviet Union with Directive 21. Historians always love to debate what-if scenarios.
It's an occupational hazard.
True. But consider this. What if Mussolini hadn't let his ego take over? What if he hadn't invaded Greece?
Oh, that's a big one.
Right. What if Germany hadn't been forced to look south toward the Mediterranean to bail him out in the spring? Would Barbarossa have started weeks earlier? Would the weather have caught the Germans differently before Moscow? Would the entire outcome of the Eastern Front have been different? The interconnectedness of these events is just staggering to think about.
It's a fascinating thread to pull on. Everything is linked.
Indeed it is. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell to be notified about new videos, click the like button, and share the video with your colleagues, as this helps us maintain the channel. Thank you.